So the world is reacting to our mistakes. But of course, our politicians will blame the world for that reaction and vilify them. That's another reason that they're going to choose inflation, because if they deliberately, crash the economy, which would be the better policy, everything would implode because nobody would have any money left over to buy anything. Everything would be sent to the government in taxes.
In today's video, Peter Schiff, founder, CEO and global strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital, gives a warning that the 2008 crisis was just the prelude to a larger sovereign debt crisis in the United States that may lead to a collapse of the US dollar.
The bigger picture, again, is that we're not going back to those sub 2% days, because this is not just about COVID. COVID really, was kind of like the spark that lit the powder keg. And I talked about that in real time. I talked about the absurdity of that monetary and fiscal policy combination in early 2020. I was one of the few people who was warning about inflation early in COVID when everybody else was talking deflation. Everybody was saying, oh, demand's really going down because of COVID, because everybody's staying at home. I was the guy that pointed out, no, it's not going down. Demand is going up because everybody is getting their stimulus money. People have more money to spend during COVID than they had before COVID. But I also pointed out the fact that we weren't producing. So supply was going down as demand was going up. So that really just it lit the fuse. But the fuse was long because it's been building since 2009, 2010, QE1. I mean, it actually started before then, but it really kicked into a higher gear. It's just that we never experienced the consequences in consumer prices. I mean, we experienced it in asset prices. I mean, those prices went up, stocks, bonds, real estate, other collectibles. We saw it in global macroeconomic imbalances. We saw it in debt levels. We saw an explosion of debt, corporate debt, government debt, consumer debt, student loans, credit card debt, auto debt. So all of those consequences of inflation were there. It's just that nobody cared about it. Nobody worried about it because it wasn't showing up in the CPI or the personal consumption expenditure index, whatever government metric the Fed claimed it relied on. So as long as the inflation wasn't there, nobody cared about it. But they should have cared about it. They should have been worrying about it. And because nobody worried about it, it got so out of control. The Fed is hopelessly behind the curve. It's impossible to catch up. I mean, it could, but it would cause a depression, not a recession. In order to really put this inflation genie back in the bottle, not only do we need higher rates, but we need huge cuts in government spending. The problem is we have an economy that depends. It's a phony economy depending on that government spending. But if you take that government spending away, then that phony economy that's been built on top of it is going to collapse. And that is going to bring about a depression-like environment, especially when the government tries to react to that, which of course it can't do if the Fed is actually going to fight inflation, which is why I know that it's not going to happen. The Fed is not going to make that choice. It's not going to choose depression over inflation. It's going to go for inflation. And then it's going to make excuses about why the inflation isn't its fault. It's going to point fingers. Maybe it's even going to point fingers at these BRIC nations, right? How dare they come up with a new currency and back it by gold, right? It's their fault. They're the ones that are doing it, ignoring the fact that we were the impetus for those decisions. It was our debasement of the dollar and our weaponization of the dollar that were the motivating factors behind those changes. So the world is reacting to our mistakes. But of course, our politicians will blame the world for that reaction and vilify them. That's another reason that they're going to choose inflation, because if they deliberately, crash the economy, which would be the better policy, if they substantially cut government spending or increase taxes. I mean, they could also have substantial middle-class tax hikes, but of course that would crush the economy too, because the middle class can barely survive the taxes they're paying now. If they had to pay significantly higher taxes to cover the government spending, everything would implode because nobody would have any money left over to buy anything. Everything would be sent to the government in taxes. So if we try to balance the books, either through spending cuts or tax hikes, then everything collapses, and the collapse will be immediate, and it will be obvious who caused it. Even if it's a good thing to do, all of the politicians are going to get thrown out. The voters are going to take out their wrath on the incumbents, and the incumbents know that. So there's no way they are going to opt for that. They are going to go for inflation, especially since they have no idea of knowing just how bad the inflation is going to get, because it builds up over time. It's not like the depression that can hit immediately. So they are going to pursue those inflationary policies in order to prevent something that they perceive as much worse from happening much sooner. But in reality, the inflation is actually an even bigger problem than the one they're too afraid to unleash. But at least from our perspective as investors, since we know the choices that the government is going to make, since we know which fork in the road they're going to take the inflation fork, we know how to position ourselves. We know that we want to be out of US dollars, which is what I've been doing for a long time, because I knew the fork that the government was going to take long before we even arrived at it, before people even realized that there was going to be a fork. I knew that it was there, and I knew which direction the cowards in Washington and at the Fed would choose. And so we have to have a portfolio that reflects that, which is out of the US dollar. And yes, even though the dollar is at a 15-month low, the dollar index is still above 100. That's still high. It was down around 70 at the lows in 2008 before the financial crisis. I think we're going to be way below 70 a few years from now. So I think 100 is still a high point to get rid of your dollars. Gold at 1,950 is still cheap. Anything below 2,000, I think, is a steal, because I think once it really moves above 2,100, we'll probably never see a sub $2,000 gold price again. In fact, it's probably going to, have a huge move up and put a lot of distance between the price of gold and 2,000, especially if the BRIC countries launch this currency and back it by gold, because then they're going to have to buy more gold to back their currency. And to the extent that this new currency becomes more popular and is more widely used, then in order to create more units, they're going to need more gold. And to get the gold, they have to buy it. You see, that's the difference between a fiat currency, which can be created at will, and a legitimate currency, which is constricted by the gold that backs it up. So when the BRIC nations launch this new currency, if it's successful, they can't just create it out of thin air like the Fed creates dollars. They're going to need gold for each new unit. And, they're not a mining operation. They're not mining the gold. They're going to have to buy the gold that has already been mined. And so that's going to put even more upward pressure. So gold has a long way to go up. And again, I think the emerging markets are a sleeper trade here. This weakness in the dollar, which is just getting started, this, I believe, is going to really ignite a boom in the emerging market stocks. I mean, people have been piling into these tech stocks and ignoring the emerging markets, just like they've been ignoring gold.